I shared on Facebook the third of the recent debates in Australia between William Lane Craig and Lawrence Krauss, entitled, "Is it reasonable to believe in God?" I was commenting that I've previously said that as much as I love Krauss, I don't think he's a good debater, but that here he really stepped up to the plate and wiped the floor with Craig. That is, I've often felt that in live debates Krauss gets overwhelmed by the bad arguments and doesn't even know where to begin. I mean, compared to Hitchens, for instance. But he was always on it here. He hit all the points Craig tried, and it was great. I wish he'd have come down harder on Craig's applicability of mathematics argument, but I guess that would have taken time away from other responses, so he's forgiven. Anyway, I shared this video on Facebook, and a friend of mine, a contact of mine, who uses a pseudonym and whose pseudonym I recognized from somewhere, but I don't remember for my life how we ended up as contacts. I think we might have met through transhumanist interests. Anyway, this guy, just in case he doesn't want the pseudonym known either, I'll call him Ed. Ed says, "Nice conversation, but it does not explain anything." And he links to a video entitled "The Signs," or "The Signs of God's Existence." Of course, I was struck right away by his comment alone. It does not explain anything. Well, what? I mean, each participant in a debate explains their position and they debate each other, which involves a lot of explanations as they object to each other's claims, try to clear up misunderstandings of their claims, provide evidence of their claims. But, I mean, yes, it's a conversation. If there's something you want to just spend time getting an explanation of, you don't watch a debate. You read or do research or watch a lecture or take a course. Debates are something you want to watch when you already understand the subject matter reasonably well. Anyway, I clicked on his link to "The Signs of God's Existence." I didn't perform a Google search on it beforehand to see what I might be getting into, although perhaps I should have. Though I'm sort of glad I didn't. You might see why. So, I'm pretty sure there must be much better responses to this video out there, as it is apparently at least a year old. But here we go. And if you're here for even 10 minutes of this, I'm sorry.
The project is literally the secularization of the world, to completely strip the world from religious beliefs. This is the project, and that is why it is called Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new secular or worldly order.
Oh, exciting. I do hope they get into presenting some evidence for that. They don't. The beginning of the video actually goes right from about a minute of atheists are propagandizing the world, programming us like computers. It goes straight from that to spending about 4 minutes conceding the Big Bang Theory, acknowledging it as agreeing with the overwhelming preponderance of evidence and being easily the most well-supported theory of the origin of the universe that we have. Basically, we know it's true. Seems like a good start, right? But then it's capped off with this.
But when this Big Bang model was first proposed in the early part of the 20th century, it was received with great skepticism by the scientific community. Because the scientific community knew that the Big Bang opened up the possibility of having a beginning and a creator and someone who began it.
I don't know how it's relevant, but the scientific community was resistant in the sense that it was critical of the theory. Because, welcome to science. The new theory had some ways to go yet to be well supported enough by the evidence. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the Big Bang model was fighting the steady state model, the model of the eternal universe. Over time, the evidence gathered in favor of the Big Bang theory, as we accumulated more and more knowledge of the earlier universe by learning more about what we could see at further distances and at greater and greater scales. The cosmic microwave background hit the steady-state model very hard. Over time, the Big Bang Theory became realized as the best theory as more evidence supported it and more evidence contradicted competing theories. Again, that's how this works. Theories need to be able to support their own weight and hold up under fire. The claim here that it was about fear of admitting it required a god, unless they're going to present some evidence of that claim, I mean, I think I understand where that's coming from, in that at the time that the theory began to be proposed, because it was not very well supported, it seemed, in comparison to the steady-state model, it opened up a gap for a god of the gaps to fill. That being misapprehension at the time about what evidence would actually be revealed supporting the theory. Evidence that, especially moving into the 21st century, would continue to fill in that gap.
Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why everything exists instead of just nothing? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused.
Until evidence suggested otherwise, yes, Bill.
Most laymen do not appreciate that not only were all matter and energy created in that event, but physical space and time themselves. This is of utmost importance, for it implies, as the Cambridge astronomer Fred Hoyle points out, that the Big Bang Theory requires the creation of the universe from nothing. Now, this tends to be very awkward for the atheist, for as Anthony Kenny of Oxford University urges, a proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But surely that doesn't make sense. Out of nothing, nothing comes.
There's this idea that the Big Bang Theory postulates that there was at some point nothing, which gets thrown around a lot. But it's just not true. The earliest point in the Big Bang model is the singularity. If you want to ask what came before the singularity, the answer is that we don't know. You pretend that we know, so that you can appear justified before audiences in pretending that you know. But there is no evidence to that effect. It seems plausible that there was nothing, but we can't really say whether it's probable. But if there was nothing, then quantum mechanics has an explanation for that, which will probably come up later, but if not, I recommend Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, or the lecture of the same name, which is on YouTube.
So where did the universe come from? Why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause.
This is called the Kalam argument, which should be very well known to people who follow theistic arguments. A quick counterexample to the first premise of the argument, that everything begins to exist has a cause, is radioactive decay. When carbon-14 decays into carbon-12, it is a causeless event. Carbon-12 began to exist, yet it wasn't caused to exist. In a debate with Quentin Smith, the acausality of radioactive decay was pointed out to Craig, and he replied, "The motions of elementary particles described by statistical quantum mechanical laws, even if uncaused, do not constitute an exception to this principle. As Smith himself admits, these considerations at most tend to show that acausal laws govern the change of condition of particles, such as the change of particle X's position from Q1 to Q2. They state nothing about the causality or acausality of absolute beginnings of the existence of particles. First of all, this shifts the goalposts of Kalam's first premise by isolating absolute beginnings as being important rather than whatever begins to exist. It also reveals that he's equivocating on the first premise with regards to beginning to exist. Craig and others commonly give examples drawn from things around us. Objects in your house, things on the streets, large objects we see in the cosmos. However, none of these things began to exist. In the same sense, theists are claiming the universe began to exist. The objects around us are merely the latest rearrangement of some atoms. When Kalam talks about the universe requiring a cause, it's not referring to it as you would a car, which is caused by a group of laborers rearranging physical matter into the form of a car, or mountains being caused by shifting the tectonic plates, which are also made of atoms that have been around since the Big Bang. Instead, Kalam is referring to creation ex nihilo, which Craig himself emphasizes often, and which is not at all the type of creation we are familiar with in every other circumstance. In expecting us to accept that everything that begins to exist has a cause, Kalam is using a word game and the fallacy of equivocation on the phrase begins to exist, to try to draw a parallel between wildly different meanings of beginning to exist. But for the sake of argument, let's set radioactive decay aside and talk about the example he provides of the new goalposts, the beginnings of the existence of particles. Particle-antiparticle formation is occurring everywhere. Things beginning to exist and annihilating each other throughout space. All space. The space between galaxies, between stars, between the particles that make up you. Also, the first and second premise together form a Russell's paradox. The first premise refers to everything, and the second premise treats the universe as if it were a member of a set of things. It's also a fallacy of composition, where the properties of all the parts are true for the whole. Describing the way physical objects within the universe behave relies on induction and physical laws, neither of which apply in the absence of a space-time universe. Everything we are familiar with is an object within a set, the universe. It is a fallacy of composition to assert that the properties of things we are familiar with, objects within the set, are also properties of the set as a whole, the universe. It's like each part of an airplane has the property of being able to fly. Therefore, the airplane has the property of being unable to fly. The conclusion doesn't follow because the only way to determine whether the airplane has the property of being able to fly or not would be to get outside of the plane, the set, and make observations. We are stuck inside the universe, so any conclusions we can draw about individual components of the universe, objects within the set, do not necessarily apply to the set as a whole. The Kalam argument, like the cosmological argument as a whole, is also suggesting a false dichotomy, where the cause, if there was one, must be supernatural. More nature, so to speak, and natural processes plausibly exist beyond our current ability to perceive. Much like, yes, a god may exist beyond our current ability to perceive, with evidence of neither, we know nothing about them, but it is clear which is more likely. You should take your beliefs a step at a time here, don't you think?
It doesn't mean it's God, doesn't mean it's Jesus, doesn't mean it's Allah, it doesn't mean anything. It just means there's a cause for the universe. So we ask another question, what is the nature of this cause? And the nature of this cause, upon conceptual analysis, which means critical thinking about this cause, we come to some startling conclusions.
Oh, I'm sure you do.
So the cause of the universe must be immaterial beyond space and time. Beyond space and time. Now, there are only two things that can fit in this category. The first, abstract objects, and the second, an embodied mind.
What? Why? How the hell do you arrive at that? You're not going to tell me, are you?
Now, what's the better candidate? Now, abstract objects, the problem with these abstract objects is they're causally effete, meaning they can't cause anything. Like, for example, the number 1 can't cause anything.
Who is saying that abstract objects create anything? I'm pretty sure no one will contradict you there. I'm waiting to hear about how the hell you arrive at your premise that the only two possible causes, assuming there is one, are abstract objects or an embodied mind. Seems like a hell of a jump, don't you think?
The simple law of arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 2, never brought anything into being. I wish it did. It never has put any money into my bank account. If I put £1,000 into the bank today and later another £1,000, the laws of arithmetic will rationally explain how it is that I now have £2,000 in the bank. But if I never put any money into the bank myself and simply leave it to the laws of arithmetic to bring money into being, I shall be permanently bankrupt.
Yeah. Well done being an atheist with regards to mathematics. You'll show those imaginary people who pray to math. Math works because all it requires is that a universe be non-magical. A universe that is consistent with itself can be described. Creationists in general seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of what a law is, which is made clear when they start saying things like, well, who wrote the laws? Who created mathematics? You say, well, we did. And they're like, aha! And I don't even know how to begin to address that depth of misunderstanding. It's like trying to explain to someone without self-awareness their own reflection. It seems like it just can't be done, like there's some underlying inherent inability. I don't know what to do with it.
Now, scientists love developing theories involving mathematical laws to describe natural phenomena, which enable them to make predictions, and they've done it with spectacular success. But most are aware, I think, that on their own the theories and laws that they find cannot create anything, let alone a universe. Yet Hawking seems to think they did.
Professor Stephen Hawking says that modern science has established there was no need for God in the creation of the universe. In a new book, Hawking suggests that a theoretical framework known as M-theory can explain how the Big Bang was an inevitable consequence of the laws of physics.
According to him, it is the laws of physics, not the will of God, that provide the real explanation as to how the universe came into being. The Big Bang, he argues, was the inevitable consequence of these laws. I quote, "Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing." Now, a supernatural being, or God, is an agent who does something. Dismissing such an agent, Hawking ascribes creative power to physical law. But physical law is not an agent. Hawking, it seems to me, is making a classical category mistake by confusing two entirely different kinds of entity: physical law and personal agency. Our physical laws are a description, usually mathematical, of what normally happens under certain given conditions. This is surely obvious from the very first example that Hawking gives in his book. The sun rises in the east. But this law does not create the sun, nor the planet Earth with east and west. It is descriptive and predictive, but not creative.
It seems to me that this guy is both equivocating on law, which he himself describes as being descriptive rather than prescriptive, but then he goes on to talk about them as if Hawking means them to be prescriptive. And he's operating from an unestablished premise that any other physical laws are possible, or that pre-singularity, if it makes any sense to talk about such a paradigm, something was magical, indescribable. It's a not very carefully veiled presupposition of the existence of God that sneaks under his argument here, forming a false premise.
So the only alternative is an embodied mind, what theists call God. An embodied mind, immaterial, outside time and space.
I can only assume that this guy is getting his abstract object or embodied mind idea from a misunderstanding of his philosophy of mathematics courses. Philosophy of mathematics has what are called embodied mind theories, which hold that mathematics can only be the product of an embodied mind. Seems pretty simple and obvious, right? But I think this guy has taken this to mean that what mathematics describes can only be a product of an embodied mind, which suggests the opposite of what the actual theories state. Embodied mind theory refers to consciousnesses observing the universe and deriving mathematics from the universe's behavior, as opposed to mathematics being some intrinsic property of the universe. He seems to be flipping it around into a God-created numbers argument, which is something the previous speaker seemed to be implying as well, that certain logical or mathematical ideas were the creation of a perfect or omnipotent mind, and therefore the fact that mathematics work is proof of God's existence, because any mind capable of creating numbers in the first place deserves to be called a god. The main weakness of this argument is that it's not clear that the numbers need creating. In fact, to suggest that a mind created the numbers and other basic logical and mathematical objects suggests that there could be a state in which they do not exist, and that there is an intelligent and creative mind capable of functioning before any basic mathematical or logical processes have occurred. To put it another way, to say that God created the numbers implies that he had some choice, and could have either not made them or made them differently. What would that even mean, to live in one of those alternate worlds? The idea is completely incoherent. And besides, do numbers exist in the way that this implies? As the speakers themselves keep emphasizing, I think it's clear that they don't.
In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to be able to explain the explanation. Folks, this is an elementary point in the philosophy of science. Suppose astronauts were to find on the backside of the moon a pile of machinery there that had not been left by American or Russian cosmonauts. What would be the best explanation for that machinery? Well, clearly it would be some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence that had left the machinery there. And you don't have to have an explanation of who these extraterrestrials were or came from or how they got there or anything of that sort in order to recognize that the best explanation of this machinery is intelligent design. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, requiring that would immediately lead to an infinite regress of explanations. You would need an explanation of the explanation, but in order to recognize that as best, you need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and then an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so that nothing could ever be explained.
I love this. The cosmological argument for a god suffers from the problem of infinite regress, so the Kalam argument simply asserts that, well, God didn't begin, so there's no regress. This is called special pleading, and it happens a lot in this video. Why is it more logically defensible to claim that, for the rule that everything must have a cause, an exception is made for God, but not for the universe as a whole? If God not having a beginning is not a problem for Craig, and other defenders of this argument, then why is it a problem for the universe? The lack of human ability when it comes to solving mysteries at the boundaries of current knowledge is not a good reason to invoke a hypothetical entity with mysterious powers that enable it to be immune from paradoxes. The God hypothesis is not only unnecessary, it is not parsimonious. In order to explain something alleged to be apparently designed, which cannot create itself, a being is conjured into existence which would require even more unlikely explanation. The Kalam argument attempts to circumvent the problem of infinite regress, but steps right into the problem of special pleading, so it's no better off. Also, let me back up to Craig's alien artifact analogy.
Suppose astronauts were to find on the backside of the moon a pile of machinery there that had not been left by American or Russian cosmonauts. What would be the best explanation for that machinery? Well, clearly it would be some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence that had left the machinery there. And you don't have to have an explanation of who these extraterrestrials were or came from or how they got there or anything of that sort in order to recognize that the best explanation of this machinery is intelligent design.
A somewhat more accurate, but still very weak analogy for the sort of claim being made here would seem to me to be the discovery of evidence that there was once single-celled life in the lunar soil, and some people claiming that this is evidence for panspermia. Is it reasonable to jump to that? Or should we be first considering that either the moon soil was separated from Earth later than expected, or that life existed on Earth earlier than expected? Anyway, this moon machinery analogy deals with a very different kind of discussion than that of the early universe, considering that we don't have those kinds of signs of design. But this counterargument is a counterargument of the argument from design, which the film gets to later, so I'll wait for that.
One of the outdated philosophical cliches, in my opinion, is that, well, who created God? We hear that all the time, and they think it's a baseball bat against the theists. But it's made of sponge. And let me tell you why. If we say, what caused the cause that caused the universe, then let's continue. What caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? Let's continue. Then what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? Let's carry on. Then what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused?
And that goes on and on and on backwards. But at one point, I have to have an uncaused cause, or there would be nothing in existence today.
To say that because we currently observe cause and effect relationships occurring in space-time, the universe itself must have had a first cause is assuming something that no one knows. Before the Big Bang, time and causality as we understand it could not be said to exist, such that to say, before the Big Bang, is nonsensical. William Lane Craig said this himself in this video. And so, to make assumptions about the behavior of matter without time is pure speculation. This is much the same as saying that a sufficiently ordered or complex universe must mean that there was a designer, just because, as far as you can tell, this is the case with things that humans design. It's an argument from incredulity.
So in essence, to claim who created God or what caused the cause of the universe is the equivalent of saying that we don't have a universe.
What?
Is the equivalent of saying that we don't have a universe.
What the fuck?
That we don't have a universe.
What the fucking fuck? What? Fuck you!
That we don't have a universe. That we don't have a universe.
Remember the premises of the argument I gave. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being out of nothing. But if something is eternal and timeless, then it doesn't fall under that first premise. It doesn't need a cause. And the concept of God is the concept of an eternal, self-existent, necessary being, and therefore the answer is simply that God is uncaused. He is self-existent.
The idea of an intelligent, universe-creating God just existing is far more difficult to explain than the universe itself just existing. Intelligence is one of the most complex things we are aware of in the universe. To assume the existence of a being who is so intelligent that it can design an entire universe as well as micromanage the personal lives of billions of people on Earth through prayer, would require an enormous amount of explanation. Saying God does not need a cause because he is outside of time is a glib non-answer. If all that is required to get around the first cause argument is an entity that exists outside of time, then all we need to do is postulate a single particle that exists outside of time and triggered the Big Bang. Besides this particle might even exist, depending on how you define outside of time. Photons do not experience time, since they move at the speed of light. Theists will object to that this particle should have a cause, but they have already refuted this argument by granting that there exists an uncaused cause in the first place. If God can exist without a cause, why not a particle? Why not the universe? It's a massive leap from either of those to a God.
Dear Dr. Craig, one of the objections which has been raised is the first law of thermodynamics, the rule that matter and energy can only be rearranged, or in other words, that matter is neither being created nor destroyed.
Yeah. What's funny about this objection is that this is not an objection to the existence of God. This would be an objection to the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. It would show that the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe is false, because according to that theory, all matter and energy, even space and time themselves, came into being at the moment of the Big Bang and are therefore not eternal. They haven't always been there in the past. So if these fellows were right, all contemporary cosmologists who believe in the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe would be contradicting the laws of thermodynamics, and that's hardly the case. Why?
The first law applies to mass and energy, not to space and time.
Well, because the laws of thermodynamics, in particular the law of the conservation of matter and energy, only applies once the universe comes into being. It applies at every moment, at every time, and every point in the universe. But it doesn't apply to the origin of the universe itself. And that's why cosmologists don't consider that the law of conservation of energy and mass is violated by the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe.
Basically, yeah.
In fact, the atheist fellow mentioned the laws of thermodynamics. He might have wanted to talk about the second law of thermodynamics, which says that in a closed system, things tend toward increasing disorder. Now, the universe on the atheistic view is just a gigantic closed system, because it is everything there is, and there's nothing outside it.
The Big Bang theory does not currently tell us what happened before the Big Bang, or whether there even was a before the Big Bang, in the sense of a point in space-time which unambiguously predates the Big Bang itself. Without knowing how much entropy, if any, was present in the pre-Bang universe, you cannot claim that the Big Bang contradicts the second law of thermodynamics.
And what that implies is that given sufficient time, everything in the universe would grind down to a state of maximum disorder. So if the universe has existed for infinite time from eternity past, why is it that we don't find ourselves in this sort of thermodynamically disordered state?
The editors of this video must have taken Craig out of context here, because there's no way that he would imply that anyone now believes the universe has existed for infinite time.
I think that the best answer to that is that the universe has not existed forever.
You got it.
It began a finite time ago in a low entropy condition, and the thermodynamic clock has been running ever since then.
Man, who gave Craig the science juice?
So the evidence of thermodynamics itself suggests that the universe and matter and energy are not infinite or eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning.
Yeah, you show them steady-state proponents, Bill. Take that, nobody in the last 48 years. You hear that, people who didn't have any of this data? Is that your cosmic microwave running?
Some strange results have come up in about the last 20, 30 years, particularly in astronomy and also in quantum physics, which suggests that the universe actually may have a purpose, and some physicists are now suggesting it does have a purpose. And this has come out of some findings about the some of the fundamental numbers in atomic physics.
During the past 40 years, scientists have determined the relative strengths of each of these primary laws and forces. These strengths are so critically balanced, they are often described as being finely tuned.
And the fine-tuning argument begins. So I'm going to try to go point by point as they try to raise examples, but before getting into that, I want to point out something ironic about the fine-tuning argument in general. It does a very good job of arguing for atheism. If you take the facts divorced from the false or unwarranted conclusions. If you accept that there is a narrow range of properties needed for the universe to develop to allow for life as we know it, I might add, which is quite a sticking point in the fine-tuning argument for theism, by the way. But anyway, this narrow range is precisely the required range needed for life in this universe to occur naturally in the absence of a god. If there were a god, rather than needing 76 trillion stars and 13.75 billion years, there would only be need of one planet, rather than having more planets than there are grains of sand on all the beaches on Earth. And the only reason that this universe needs to be this vast and this old is if life occurs naturally without any intelligent design. If life occurs this way, then any life that exists should exist in an amazingly vast universe just to allow the chemicals needed to kick up life. Enough chances to happen to kick up something as complex as life. Only upon the assumption of atheism do we really need these exact values, for only these values allow the formation of life to occur without a god and without any outside influences. If the universe looked exactly as if it couldn't be natural, theists would, and do, claim that God exists in that case as well. So the universe either cannot happen naturally and therefore God did it, or the universe can happen naturally and wow, that's so amazing, therefore God did it. This is Brian's paradox.
I'm not the Messiah! Will you please listen? I am not the Messiah! Do you understand? Honestly!
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
What? Well, what sort of chance does that give me? All right, I am the Messiah! He is the Messiah!
Heads, I win. Tails, you lose.
For example, the strengths of the other forces are all important, the masses of the various subatomic particles. This is one of a long list of properties in underlying physics that seem to be prerequisites for a universe with life. If all of these things were even a little bit different, then life, certainly life as we know it, could not exist.
Yes, how amazing it is that we exist in a universe in which life like us can exist. Also, a problem arises from the premise that the cosmological constants are in fact fine-tuned at all. The premise assumes that there is a certain range of values that each constant could assume. The greater these ranges, the more unlikely that a given set of constants would have assumed the values we observe. However, to simply imagine a certain range of possible numerical values that each constant could assume and calculating the probability that this value would have been arrived at randomly is fallacious for two reasons. Currently, we have no access to the data that would tell us what range the constants could possibly assume in reality, or how many trials there were in which the constants assumed certain values. If in a lottery one number were drawn from a pot of 5 numbers, then winning the lottery would become comparatively likely. Likewise, if a trial with an extremely unlikely outcome, like winning an actual national lottery, were to be repeated a sufficient number of times, it would become likely as well.
Well, obviously, if you're not a theist, and especially if you're a person who would prefer the universe to be a godless sort of universe, those are the sorts of facts that can make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So there's no shortage of persons trying to derail the argument from fine-tuning. One popular way to try and do that is to take the fine-tuning data, not so much to suggest that there's a God who made this universe, but that perhaps our universe is one of bajillions of others. If you think about a multiverse, if you think that there are jillions and jillions of universes out there, you might reason to yourself that, well, at least one of them had to turn out right. And it just so happens to be ours. Lucky for us.
Yeah. Look at those fish in those oceans. They just happen to exist in the oceans. Lucky for them. Fuck! I mean, how would you expect us to be existing in a universe in which we can't exist? What is this? Okay, what do you think existing in a universe without a god would look like? Is it different from this one? No, right? Because Brian's paradox, right? Because heads God, tails not no God.
As we look at the details of nature, one thing stands out. This is the order, the patterns, the symmetry that surround us. You can see it in a flower, or a snowflake, or even a seashell. What we are seeing is intelligent design, which might be described as God's fingerprints upon nature.
Using beauty as an argument for the existence of God. I find these things pretty, so they must have been designed by God. First of all, notice that you also find things ugly, especially things like animals that are common carriers of disease, or the effects of those diseases. Notice that the things you find most aesthetically attractive are the things that most benefit you if you find them so. Notice that different animals seem to be attracted and repelled by different things. Notice the role that evolution plays in it all. Notice also that the things you find beautiful are not always beneficial to find beautiful, and the things you find ugly aren't necessarily bad for you, thanks to loopholes or blind spots, things that just failed to affect our evolutionary history in that specific way, or got co-opted by the effect of something else. You're assuming, for some reason, that God has the same taste in interior decorating as you. Anyway, you can probably find more about this sort of argument on Wikipedia if you search argument from aesthetics, or maybe argument from beauty.
One of the more fascinating math relationships was first described back in medieval times, 8 centuries ago. The scholar's name was Leonardo Fibonacci, an outstanding Italian mathematician. He excelled in many areas, and one in particular. He generated a long list of numbers by, in each case, adding together the two previous numbers. You can begin with a 2 and a 3. You add them together and you get 5. Now add 3 and 5 to get 8. Then add 5 and 8 to get 13. The Fibonacci sequence keeps going like this: 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, and so on. What Fibonacci realized was that this elegant list of numbers describes many items to be found in nature. For example, flower petals.
The film goes on from here to do a lot of gee-whizzing about how many results of recursive processes can be described by a sequence that obeys recursion relations. They present a bunch of examples of the Fibonacci sequence in nature. I don't know to what end. I don't know why they think it's surprising that densely packed circular formations turn out that way. They never say. I mean, wow, a useful structure is one that has ended up being used in species that have been successful. That's really something. There's also a bit on the golden spiral, but none of the claims about it are true. Like the Nautilus shell, which bears a superficial resemblance to the golden spiral, but it's not described by it at all. They do the same thing with spiral galaxies, and the same applies there. Nature has many spiral forms. None of them are golden spirals. Many don't even come close. and none of them are explained by Fibonacci mathematics. They also go on to point out how there are examples of the golden ratio in physics, which is meant to show something.
This is just amazing. There's no defense that a random universe theorist in academia can give to counter this. There's no reason at all that the quantum base of reality should be exhibiting the specific number of the golden ratio if we live in a random universe.
The quantum base of reality exhibits many things, many of which aren't applicable to things we're familiar with, and like the golden ratio sometimes is. I don't know how you're getting from that to intelligent design at all. You say there's no defense, but I don't even know the allegation. Also, the use of random implied here isn't really applicable. It reminds me of how creationists will object to evolution on the basis of the improbability of an eye just spontaneously forming all at once. Of course that's too improbable, but it's nobody's claim. It reveals a misunderstanding of the role of randomness. Speaking of evolution, at this point, the film jumps into On the Origin of Species, pointing out that Karl Marx was a fan of the book. I trust I don't have to go into what a pointless thing that is to say, so moving on.
Darwin proposed that all species evolve successively from a common ancestor. But how did that first living thing come into being? Darwin did not address this question at all in his book.
And books on geology generally don't address astrophysics. It wasn't the subject of the book, and abiogenesis doesn't need to be true for evolution to be. They're separate subjects, obviously related, but not interdependent.
He was not even aware that this point was one of the biggest refutations of his theory.
How does the origin of life impact the theory of evolution by natural selection at all? Let alone be the biggest refutation of the theory.
The primitive understanding of science in his day assumed that life had a very simple structure. According to a theory called spontaneous generation, which was popular since the medieval age, it was believed that living things could easily arise from non-living matter. It was commonly thought that frogs spontaneously arose from mud and bugs from food leftovers.
Spontaneous generation. Are we really about to go into something that was disproven in the 17th century?
And some curious experiments were designed to prove these theories. A handful of wheat was left on a rag, and mice were expected to arise from the mixture. The maggots on meat were also taken as evidence that life could generate from non-living matter. But later it was understood that such maggots did not form spontaneously, but that they emerged from microscopic larvae deposited on the meat by flies.
Yeah, this happened 200 years before Darwin. It was certainly the common belief about microorganisms until Louis Pasteur's broth experiment. But I don't understand why we're talking about spontaneous generation.
And in Darwin's time, the belief that microbes could emanate easily from non-living materials was very common. But 5 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, the famous French biologist Louis Pasteur scientifically refuted these myths that lay ground for evolution.
Spontaneous generation, a medieval idea that nobody believes, lays ground for evolution? Where is this coming from? And I love how he says, in Darwin's time, and 5 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species, directing the viewer to believe that evolution relies on spontaneous generation. He uses the premise that this argument is true in order to argue that the argument is true. Darwin actually stated On the Origin of Species that he suspected that no environments for abiogenesis would exist on present-day Earth because such environments would be quickly consumed by various existing organisms.
Can matter organize itself? No. Today there is no circumstance known under which one could affirm that microscopic beings have come into the world without parents resembling themselves.
Yeah, and the theory of evolution agrees, and abiogenesis doesn't contradict it. Is there supposed to be some argument here that it does?
The first evolutionist to take up the issue of the origin of life in the 20th century was the Russian biologist Alexander Oparin. His aim was to explain how the first living cell, the alleged common ancestor of all living beings according to the theory of evolution, could emerge. In the 1930s, Oparin formulated a number of theories to show how the first living cell could arise from inanimate matter by chance. However, his efforts ended in failure, and Oparin himself had to confess. Unfortunately, the origin of the cell remains a question that is actually the murkiest aspect of the whole theory of evolution.
This kind of neglects to mention that Oparin's work is tremendously outdated. They also say that it ended in failure, which is pretty misleading. Oparin wasn't seeking to prove abiogenesis. He was attempting to discover things about how it might have occurred. He and John Haldane both independently worked out scenarios of chemical evolution. They concluded from various chemical grounds that Earth had originally had hydrogen, ammonia, carbon dioxide, methane, and other simple compounds in its atmosphere, but no oxygen molecules. Larger and larger molecules, by various chemical processes, formed until some of them succeeded in making copies of themselves, forming the first living things. But much of the Oparin-Haldane scenario was little better than hand-waving, and the first concrete support was provided by the Urey-Miller experiments.
Evolutionists that followed Oparin conducted experiments to find an evolutionist explanation to the origin of life. The most famous of these experiments was conducted by the American chemist Stanley Miller in 1953. Miller obtained a few simple organic molecules by triggering a reaction among gases that he claimed would have been present in the primitive Earth atmosphere. At the time, this experiment was regarded as a scientific proof for evolution. It turned out to be no such thing at all. Later discoveries showed that the gases used in the experiment were very different from the gases that had been present in the early atmosphere of the world.
Urey-Miller experiments have been repeated with a variety of energy sources and other conditions. And as long as the source mixture is chemically reducing, organic molecules readily form. Earth's early atmosphere as we know it to have been today is chemically reducing. But even if it wasn't, the hot springs and the thermal events would have been.
Miller himself eventually admitted to the invalidity of his experiment. The biggest impasse confronting evolution is the incredibly complex structure of the living cell. Every living thing on Earth is made up of cells about 1/100th of a millimeter in size. Some living things are made up of a single cell. Yet even these single-cell organisms are remarkably complex in their composition. They have complicated functions to survive, and even little motors to move. Powerful electron microscopes invented around the middle of the 20th century began revealing just how complex and organized a living cell really was. They laid bare a complexity and organization that could not be a product of chance. A living cell is comprised of thousands of tiny parts that work in harmony. To make a comparison, within the cell, there are power stations, high-tech factories, a complex data bank, huge storage systems, advanced refineries, and a seemingly conscious cell membrane that controls what enters and leaves the cell. In order for the cell to survive, all of these organelles have to exist at the same time. It is impossible that such an intricate and complex system could have emerged as a result of coincidences.
So here we really start to see the argument from design, which can be summarized with this syllogism. Premise 1. We appear to observe features in nature too complex to have happened by chance. Premise 2. These features exhibit the hallmark appearance of design. Premise 3. Design implies that there must be a designer. Conclusion 1. Therefore, nature must be the result of an intelligent designer. Conclusion 2. This designer is God. The first premise is a fallacy of argument from ignorance, in that it ignores that nature is too complex to have occurred by natural processes. Either that, or it's willfully ignoring what we already know about the facts of evolution. It's also begging the question as to whether something can be too complex for evolution at all. How would we know whether something is too complex without a sampling of confirmed examples, contrasting natural low-complexity cases versus supernatural high-complexity cases? The second premise allows for equivocation on design. Consider the many definitions of design. Man-made things are designed a posteriori. We know of designers. We know of companies that make designed things. Things made of plastic which don't occur in nature, or finely polished, purified silver which doesn't appear in nature. Because of our knowledge of the world, we can logically conclude they are designed. Seeing design in nature involves confusing the direction of causality. To find life in surroundings that seem well-suited to it, to the extent that they are well-suited, is not surprising, but it is not evidence that it was designed for our benefit. It is exactly what would be expected as a result of evolutionary processes. The second premise is also special pleading in regards to the recognition of design. At this point in the video, for example, the organisms are presented as apparently designed. But in comparison to what? The appearance of design is subjective. What features denote design? Complexity? Order? Beauty? Suitability to a purpose? Any of these can be lacking in objects we know to be designed. We recognize designed objects by comparison with previously known designed objects, by contrasting them with naturally occurring objects. In a universe that was actually designed, it would not be possible to compare, for there wouldn't be anything that would be naturally occurring. There is also a false, unstated premise implicit in the argument that such design cannot be done by the organism or the system itself, or rather that self-design is impossible. This is false because self-design is both possible and real. There are multiple examples of it. Evolution, which is the scientific explanation for the complexity and design of life, is an algorithmic description of a process of self-design. The human brain is also capable of self-design. One can, simply by thinking about a problem, come to a coherent answer to the question without outside influence, resulting in a more complex system. The conclusion of the argument from design is also a self-refuting case of special pleading. The entire premise of the argument is based on the notion that there are multiple aspects of nature too complex to have simply sprung into existence, ignoring the obvious evolutionary strawman that anything of this nature ever sprung into existence. The idea of solving this imagined problem of complexity by invoking an infinitely complex, and thus, by the intelligent design proponent's own argument, an infinitely improbable deity, doesn't really make sense at all. William Lane Craig responds to this objection early in the film by claiming that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't need an explanation of the explanation.
In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to be able to explain the explanation. Folks, this is an elementary point in the philosophy of science.
He explains this by asserting that if some things were not recognized as the best explanation, there would always be infinite regress and it would destroy science.
In fact, when you think about it, requiring that would immediately lead to an infinite regress of explanations. You would need an explanation of the explanation, but in order to recognize that as best, you need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and then an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so that nothing could ever be explained.
It is effectively a straw man of the scientific method. Whilst a theory may provide the best explanation for a particular part of nature, it is the very nature of science to question its importance. If evidence comes up that doesn't support the theory and it is compelling, the theory will either be discarded or adapted. Then the same testing will occur for the next theory, and so on. In fact, it would probably destroy science if explanations were just accepted. If an hypothesis hasn't been tested, there is no way to find out if it is the best explanation, or if it is true or false. Also, Craig offers nothing but blind assertion as to why there would be an infinite regress if an explanation isn't accepted as the best one.
So there's a big question, if you're just kind of trying to assess how likely is it that we'd find a protein by chance with all the amino acids in that prebiotic soup interacting with each other for, say, billions of years. And I give it a lot of time. How likely is it that we'd ever get a protein to arise by chance? So I have a colleague who's been interested in the whole question of whether or not life could arise by chance for a long time. His name is Doug Axe. He's a molecular biologist. He did his PhD at Caltech. He worked for 14 years at Cambridge University, and he wanted to find out how common or how rare are the functional sequences of amino acids among the big space of all the possible amino acids there are. And he came up with a really amazing number. And it's 10 to the 74 power. So just to get the amino acid sequence properly, you've got an odds of about 1 in 10 to the 74.
Imagine that I asked you to demonstrate evolution by transforming a chimpanzee into a human. Hopefully you would recognize the fallacy and understand that chimps and humans share a common ancestor, and both have evolved substantially since the two lineages diverged. In order to change a chimp into a human, you would first have to devolve back into the common ancestor and proceed from there. That requires a lot of changes. Now let's think about two enzymes that are members of the same gene family but have evolved different functions. It's easiest to think of these two enzymes that are now specific for similar but distinct substrates. Imagine that you were asked to demonstrate evolution by changing one of those enzymes into the other. Would you recognize the same fallacy? Would you realize that the most likely evolutionary scenario is that the two different enzyme specificities evolved from an ancestral enzyme that carried out both functions? Changing one of the modern enzymes into the other would require many changes because, in most cases, the common ancestor dates back hundreds of millions of years. Many of the changes that have become fixed in the two lineages were not directly involved in selecting one of the substrates over the other. They were neutral mutations fixed by random genetic drift after the enzyme became specialized for one of the substrates. Many would have to be reversed in order to recreate the dual specificity because they would have been detrimental to the ancestral enzyme. Think of these facts as you watch Doug Axe explain the research that Stephen Meyer just referred to.
But there's other probabilistic hurdles that have to be overcome. If you want to build a protein, we know from chemistry that you have to attach the amino acids together with what's called a peptide bond. In nature, peptide bonds occur with about a 1 in 2 frequency. Half the bonds that form between amino acids are peptide bonds, half aren't. But if you get any bonds forming that aren't peptide bonds, you can't form a protein. So to form a protein, 150 amino acids long, you've got a 1 in 2 chance at each site of getting the correct type of linkage. So you got 1 in 2 times 1 in 2 times 1 in 2 times 1 in 2 to the what power? Close to 150. Since we got linkages, we have 149, but call it 150, okay? So in other words, we got another huge exponential problem to overcome. So, and it turns out that 1 in 2 to the 150 is the same number as 10 to the 45th, 1 in 10 to the 45. So now we got two incredibly improbable things that we've got to overcome to build a functional protein by chance alone. One more problem. When you're building proteins, amino acids come in 2 flavors. There's a left-handed flavor and a right-handed flavor. They're called optical isomers, not flavors, okay? And the left-handed version is the only kind that can be used in building proteins. You get even one right-handed amino acid in there, and your protein won't fold properly. So you got another probabilistic hurdle to overcome. So you've got a 1 in 2 chance at each site again, out to the 150th power. 2 to the 150th power, again, is 10 to the 45. Oh my goodness. So the odds of building even a short functional protein by chance alone is 74 plus 40. You can remember how you do this in math? You can add the exponents if you're multiplying exponential numbers.
164.
Thank you very much. Okay? Wow. Now, can anyone get their mind around a number that big? There's only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the entire universe. There's only 10 to the 16th seconds since the Big Bang. There's only 10 to the 139th total events since the beginning of the universe. Now you're starting to get the understanding of why people are very skeptical that the chance hypothesis is going to do the job.
So there's a 1 in 2 chance of forming a peptide bond for each of 150 amino acids. But you calculate the probability as if it has to happen all at once. But there's no reason it has to happen all at once. This guy is Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute, and he's calculated the probability of a protein spontaneously forming, not the probability of a protein evolving. He seems to imagine the proteins popping into existence in one shot, with all the amino acids randomly chosen. But we see evolution does not work like that. Immunoglobulins, for example, can be shown to have evolved from simpler globulins, so that only a few changes were made at a time. Since natural selection retained only some of them, there were no overwhelming odds to overcome.
Now, you may have heard just the opposite. Has anyone ever gotten in a discussion with you about the origin of life and said, hey, it happened by chance? I mean, do you hear that? I mean, this happens to me. I'll be lecturing in hospital, university environments, and I'll get done and somebody say, well, but, and they want to argue with me about the probabilities. And I just shut the discussion down because I say, no serious scientist thinks this is the way it happened. No serious scientist thinks this is the way it happened.
Now you're getting it. You're arguing against a straw claim that proteins formed spontaneously as opposed to evolving incrementally under selective pressures. Also, this film does echo like that at the end of practically half the clips. It's really funny. I've edited out most of them from the video in the interest of time, but I had to acknowledge it at least once because it's so hilarious to me. They also do shit like throwing up pictures of evil scientists literally in front of a backdrop of a lightning storm, crashing lightning as they speak their name. It's really... I thought about doing this whole video as a parody of the film, but in the end I couldn't convince myself it was worth the time. Anyway, 10 minutes following all this, the 10 minutes following all this, is all argument from design, based on the complexity of DNA and RNA. And I've already addressed the argument from design insofar as they address it here, so I'm skipping that.
The science of genetics that developed at the beginning of the 20th century proved that it was not acquired physical traits, but only genes that were transmitted to subsequent generations.
I don't suppose those genes exhibit variation, do you? If this were true, then we'd be exact copies of our parents. But every new generation is unique, and over time, that's evolution, babe. But yeah, way to argue against Lamarckian evolution, I guess? This film really makes a habit of this shit. They just tried to blur away the huge distinction between Lamarckian and Darwinian evolution.
This discovery made it clear that a scenario suggesting that acquired traits accumulated from generation to generation and generated different living species was implausible. In other words, there were no inheritable variations for Darwin's proposed mechanism of natural selection to choose from. Subsequently, the theory of evolution as advanced by Darwin has been collapsed early in the 20th century.
It's the 21st century now, did you know that? This whole film spends a lot of time citing stuff from the early 20th century, when there were briefly some problems between the relative newness of evolutionary theory and experimental methods at the time, completely neglecting the century since that has wound up confirming evolution by natural selection on every front and observing evolution directly.
All the other efforts by evolutionists in the 20th century could do nothing but only confirm that natural selection had no evolutionary power.
Natural selection has no evolutionary power. Well, you've got my attention. That is an amazing claim.
A famous evolutionist, the English paleontologist Colin Patterson, admitted this when he said, "No one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever got near it, and most of the current argument in neo-Darwinism is about this question."
Of course not. It's a contradiction in terms, because then it wouldn't be natural selection. We have directly observed a lot of evolution by selection, by placing selective pressures on populations, pressures that can and do occur in nature. This is another case of special pleading.
The theory of evolution now holds that living things are differentiated from one another and develop as a result of mutations. This cannot be true, for mutations only damage the information in the DNA and give only harm to a living being.
Most mutations are completely neutral and have no effect on the fitness of an organism. Even if that weren't the case, the theory of evolution does not need more than a few adaptive or beneficial mutations. The number of maladaptive mutations is simply irrelevant, because these mutations are selected out, and the few adaptive mutations go on. Also, whether a mutation is harmful, or beneficial, or neutral in terms of increasing the functionality or survival of an organism is highly contextual. A mutation that can be harmful in one environment, such as a decreased subcutaneous fat layer on a polar animal, could turn out to be helpful if the environment changes, such as if the temperature increases. Aside from mutations which simply destroy embryonic development or cause premature death, there is no real objective measure of whether a mutation is harmful or not. Similarly, whether or not a mutation is ultimately harmful or beneficial can also be quite complex. Sickle cell anemia, although life-threatening when homozygous, can result in a benefit. People who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia are significantly less likely to get malaria from mosquitoes, as the sickle cells die almost immediately after the malaria parasites enter them.
No beneficial mutation has yet been observed either in nature or in laboratories.
Many beneficial gene variants have been studied. For example, a point mutation in the LPR5 gene causes high bone density, which could be adaptive in environments where one is likely to be injured. In bacteria, plasmids often mutate to grant antibiotic resistance, which is a beneficial mutation for the bacterium. Not so beneficial for us, because this is why penicillin and other antibiotics are becoming much less useful than they once were.
Since mutations do not add new genetic information, it is impossible for living beings to acquire new organs through mutations.
Is new information being generated? That's what evolutionists have to come up with. Right. They have to have a mechanism that generates new, never before existing genetic information that can build all these bigger and better structures. Right.
Genomes can grow and shrink with mutation. Bases can be inserted or deleted. Genes can be added by retroviruses. Whole sections of the genome can be duplicated or deleted, and even an entire chromosome or genome could be doubled or halved. Say a certain gene codes to produce a certain protein. A duplication mutation causes duplication of this gene. So now there are 2 copies of the gene in this genome. This mutation is not a harmful mutation, since it supplies a protein that is already there, and as such it has little or no effect on the organism. Then a second mutation causes the copy to make a different version of the protein, which adds some new ability or function. That mutation would be selected for because it is beneficial. Now, the information in the second gene has been added without any loss in genome space. A similar mechanism can work by using some of the unused DNA that makes up the majority of all genomes.
That supposedly never existed before. Right, right. Never before existing information. Back when there was only a single cell that gave rise to all the diversity of life, there wasn't information for skin and hair and heart and a brain and so on. Right. So you have to generate it somehow, according to evolution. Right. Now, Dr. Werner Gitt is an information specialist. Since we're talking about information, we'll go to an information specialist. He wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information that you and I both love. And in his book he says this: a code system is always the result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. He goes on to say, there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Right.
There are 2 broad types of phenomena, those being entities and relationships. DNA is a type of molecule that is made up of both entities and relationships, those being the atoms that compose it, and the way they are bonded together, respectively. Ultimately, DNA is a phenomenon. Intelligent beings label phenomenon. The theory of abiogenesis has shown that it is possible for this self-replicating molecule to emerge by natural causes. And there are other theories of how other self-replicating systems that undergo random mutation and non-random natural selection can occur naturally. Information is not an inherent quality of a phenomenon. Phenomena are entirely random, or causal, by their very nature. If this particular phenomenon happens to have the behavior of building and folding proteins that form what we label a living organism, and the way this phenomenon attained its form and composition is easily explained by the theory of evolution and the theory of abiogenesis, then it becomes clear that the word information is just a word that describes the composition of something, whether it is designed or not designed. If we agree to the premise that information is an inherent quality of DNA, because it is expressed as a living organism, then how is the clear line drawn to exclude the particular phenomenon of life from all other phenomena in existence? You see what I'm saying? It is entirely reasonable to infer that rocks contain information if information is defined as the composition and form of an entity. The confusion results from the fact that information is classically described as either an entity or a quality of entities. The precise arrangement of atoms in a pebble does not have any relevant meaning or value to a person, but a particular pebble and the way its atoms are arranged by completely random causal forces could be assigned value by a scanning electron microscope. It would scan the surface of the pebble and assign meaningful values to the composition of atoms on the whole surface of the pebble, so that if you put any other pebble inside the stage, the translation would be incoherent and random. But if you have the particular pebble inside the stage, then the translation would be meaningful. If one considers DNA code to be full of information, then we know how that information got there, through a process of evolution by natural selection, which has not only been shown to produce useful information, but to be the best explanation for the diversity of life on this planet and the DNA configuration of that life. Therefore, we have a counterexample to the premise that there is no natural phenomenon which can generate information in such a coherent manner, because we have a complete explanation for DNA that is a purely natural phenomenon. The argument is also self-refuting. If we accept the premise that DNA contains information, and that only minds can create information, then it is safe to assume that for minds to create information, they must contain information. This then begs the question, what mind created the information in God's mind? We get back into infinite regress.
This is why Professor Richard Dawkins, one of the most renowned advocates of the theory of evolution of our day, hesitates when he is asked to give a single example that increases the genetic information.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
This is an infamously misleading clip of Dawkins hesitating or being stumped about new information in the genome. A clip which, strangely enough, appears in multiple inconsistent contexts. There are different versions of the video that show a very different, it's performed by a different interviewer. They might loop Dawkins' response in a very obvious way. There are videos where the interviewer is obviously not even in the same room that Dawkins was. There are those that are obviously voiced over. There are ones that are cut differently. Anyway, the question can be answered easily, and he had already, at the time of this clip's recording, answered it before. The expressions you see are in the full clip, followed by a request for the interview to end, and are due to his realization that he's being misled with regards to the interviewer's intentions. Not that it matters in any way, but you can find more information at a link in the description.
And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
Richard Dawkins is his name. Arguably the world's most famous atheist. I don't know how you would test for that, but maybe we'll ask him. So, right off the bat, what's wrong with, in your opinion, with believing in a God, regardless of who the God is?
I think it's false. I think that it's a matter of belief without evidence. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Yes, Ben, we might find evidence. Not have, not will, not probably will. We might. Welcome to intellectual honesty. Isn't it grand?
In the 20th century, The theory of evolution was refuted not only by molecular biology, but also by paleontology, that is, fossil science.
A second proof usually offered is the fossil record. According to most biology textbooks, fossils show the gradual development of life from simple to complex over hundreds of millions of years. But a growing number of scientists say that this textbook story is incomplete and even misleading, because it ignores an extraordinary event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion.
The oldest stratum of the Earth in which fossils of living creatures have been found is that of the Cambrian, which has an estimated age of 500 to 530 million years. In strata older than the Cambrian, no fossils of any creatures except a few unicellular organisms are to be seen. In the Cambrian period, however, many diverse species appear quite abruptly. More than 30 invertebrate species, such as jellyfish, starfish, trilobites, and snails, emerge all of a sudden.
If by all of a sudden you mean over the course of tens of millions of years, yeah, it's an interesting period of significant improvement and expansion of the fossil record, but it's not even slightly as sudden as you're making it sound. Also, there was complex life before the Cambrian, and precursors of the major groups have been found, including pre-Cambrian vertebrates.
In Darwin's theory, if you think of the branching tree, Darwin's branching tree, the common ancestor down here and the different modern forms of animals up here, you would have one form to begin with, and then it would gradually diverge into slightly different forms and more different until you get the major differences that we see now. The problem with the Cambrian explosion is that all these major differences appear together at the same time, with no fossil evidence that they descended from this common ancestor.
One quite relevant element of the seemingly suddenly more diverse fossil record of the Cambrian is that, at this time, many life forms appear to have only recently evolved the ability of incorporating calcium as calcium carbonate into their bodies, vastly increasing the chances of them appearing as fossils today. The circumstances leading to fossilization are pretty rare to begin with, but fossils of organisms prior to the development of hard body parts, such as shells, bones, and teeth, is especially scarce for pretty obvious reasons. Another point is that the evolution of complex organisms requires all the basic components of complex life, the ability to produce bone-like structures, hormonal regulation, and so on. The explosion simply indicates the point in time when all the necessary substrates of complex animals were present, allowing for the evolution of all the different phyla. Also, the Cambrian explosion fossil evidence is based on 3 sites that are highly unusual fossilization events, rarely seen in other periods, and therefore the explosion may be an observer artifact resulting from the nature of those unusual fossilization events. And if it's not, then it's also worth noting that tectonic activity in the Cambrian was undergoing very rapid movement relative to the Earth's poles, resulting in rapid and unstable climate changes. This would stress ecological systems and promote more rapid evolutionary change.
The article reported on cutting-edge research by Chinese scientist J.Y. Chen, an internationally respected paleontologist at the Nanjing Institute of Paleontology and Geology. Chen's discoveries in the fossil beds in Xinjiang, China, have rocked the scientific establishment. Located in the province of Yunnan in southern China, Xinjiang has some of the world's best-preserved fossils from the Cambrian era.
Darwinism helps them maybe only telling a part story for evolution.
According to Chen, the fossils he's discovered turn Darwin's tree of life upside down.
Darwin's tree, reverse coinship, very unexpectedly, our research is convincing major phyla starting down below at beginning of Cambrian. Base is wide, gradually narrow, so this is almost turned on differently.
As I pointed out before, this is simply not true. Many phyla, including cnidarians, mollusca, Annelida, and Arthropoda existed before the Cambrian. In any case, the basic implication of this critique seems to misunderstand how evolutionary taxonomy works. Classifications like phyla are to some extent arbitrary, a human-created and assigned system of groupings. Furthermore, these groupings are intrinsically hierarchical. All of the descendants of ancient creatures will, by the very nature of the classification system, be classified as subvariants of previous groups. It is thus not an accident that there was a time when what we distinguish as phyla appear in the fossil record, but that there are no new phyla appearing today. It is a direct result of the way in which these categories are assigned. All modern life is descended from previous life, and as such, all new categories are below the phylum level. Hence, the phyla all emerging at around a given era in history is a direct result of the cladistic evolutionary tree of life and the particular way that the classification system is applied to it.
This fatal stroke that frightened Darwin comes from the Cambrian period, right at the outset of the fossil record.
Exactly. When you're defining phyla in the present and tracing them back through history, you're going to reach a point where those classifications first began to emerge from a narrower set. Also, this fatal stroke that frightened Darwin?
No fossil remains supporting evolution have ever been unearthed in excavations conducted in every corner of the world.
It's like saying the geological record doesn't support plate tectonics theory. It's like saying there are no fossil remains. It's like... Okay, just for a start, I recommend the Wikipedia article entitled List of Transitional Fossils. If you don't like Wikipedia because it's a tool of the secular elite or some shit, then go straight to the references, I guess, or, I don't know, go somewhere and learn anything. I mean, holy shit. Let's move on.
6,500 different ape species have lived so far, and the majority of them are extinct. The skulls of these extinct apes, both big and small, constituted a great resource for evolutionists on which to exercise their imaginations freely.
Fossil comparisons are made by rigorously examining and measuring every minute detail of the fossil. Imagination plays no part in forensic sciences.
Evolutionists concocted the scenario of human evolution. The most important role of this scenario is given to the extinct ape species called Australopithecus. The first Australopithecus fossil was found in 1924 by a paleontologist named Raymond Dart. Since then, evolutionists argue that this ape species, the name of which means southern ape, is a man-like creature. However, when Australopithecus and chimpanzee skeletons are compared, it is seen that there is no important difference between the two.
First of all, Australopithecus isn't a species, it's an entire genus. The species you're talking about, you even showed its name on screen, is Australopithecus afarensis. Anyway, setting that aside, what the hell is an important difference? Afarensis had human-like teeth, the jaw was between the parabolic shape of humans and the rectangular shape of other modern apes, and their pelvic and leg bones far more closely resembled those of modern humans. They had long, flat iliac blades. The femurs enter the hip at a different angle. The arm-to-leg ratio is different. All of these are features that A. afarensis shares not with chimps, but with humans. And all of them are adaptations for walking upright.
In the face of this fact, Evolutionists hypothesized that Australopithecus walked upright on its 2 feet, differently from other apes. However, 2 world-renowned anatomists, Lord Solly Zuckerman and Professor Charles Oxnard, refuted this allegation.
Solly Zuckerman's attempts were debunked in the 50s, and the way this statement is phrased is misleading, making it sound as if Charles Oxnard argued that Australopithecines were not bipedal. He didn't. He claimed that they were probably bipedal, but did not walk identically to modern humans. Oxnard did attempt to demonstrate that Australopithecines were no more similar to humans than modern non-human apes are. But his results were based on measurements of a few skeletal bones, which were usually fragmentary and very poorly preserved. The measurements neglected to describe the shape of several bones, noting only basic dimensions like length and width, and didn't distinguish between aspects which are important for understanding locomotion from those which were not. There is an overwhelming body of evidence contradicting Oxnard's work. Studies that used the techniques Oxnard used, and a variety of others. Based on many different body parts and joint complexes, they overwhelmingly indicate not just that Afarensis was bipedal, but that the Australopithecines altogether resemble humans more closely than other modern apes.
Simply put, Australopithecus, advanced as the ancestor of man by evolutionists, is merely an extinct ape species.
I don't understand how this is supposed to be a point. Australopithecus afarensis is both extinct and an ape species. You've got it.
On the other hand, fossils that are included by evolutionists under imaginary classifications, such as Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, or Homo sapien archaic, in fact belong to different human races.
Species in our own genus that strongly resemble our own species? Well, that just won't do.
When these fossils are inspected, it is seen that their skeletons are essentially the same as those of people living today.
Mostly correct. By far the most dramatic changes throughout the genus Homo have been in the skull. When a certain morphology is successful, then any more change is likely to lower the fitness of the animal, and it will be selected against. It's called normalizing selection. Cockroaches have remained morphologically unchanged for hundreds of millions of years because they found their winning formula back then.
The only dissimilarities are a few structural differences in their skulls.
Pointing out that the differences between a set of species in a genus are by far mostly isolated to a certain set of changes is, well, it's beginning to understand evolution, so well done on that. The earlier statements in this evolution section of the video seem to suggest that its creators believe evolution is supposed to be a constant, steady, full-body series of changes regardless of the evolutionary stresses at work. So this is a breath of fresh air, I guess?
But differences like these are to be found in different human races alive on Earth today.
And this is just wacky. The variation within each arbitrary human race is greater than the variation between each race, and both ranges of variation are nothing in comparison to the differences between these remains and Homo sapiens. You know, this does shed some light on why you guys insist there are no transitional fossils. Because with the way you think, nothing even imaginable could ever be interpreted as transitional. If it's more like a modern human, you consider it just a race of human. And if it's more like another ape, you just consider it just an ape. It really does lead me to wonder what your expectations are. How do you think evolution works? Ignoring that all the fossils are transitional, what do you think a transitional fossil would look like? Is this a crocoduck thing happening here?
The famous evolutionist paleontologist Richard Leakey admits that the difference between the skulls classified as Homo erectus and those of modern men is only racial. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans.
Talk about out of fucking context. In that quote, Leakey was arguing that Homo erectus and Homo ergaster should be regarded as a single species, because the anatomical range of features was no wider than that of modern human races. However, the range of ergaster and erectus features does not fall within the modern human range, and Leakey was not saying that it did. But I guess you'd actually have to read a whole paragraph to know that, so you're excused.
The only defense left to evolutionists against all these scientific facts is just one thing: propaganda.
This irony is too much for my hemochromatosis.
The baseless scenario of the human evolution is imposed on the public by means of imaginary drawings that appear in evolutionist publications.
I don't think they're imaginary drawings. You're showing them right there.
From time to time, drawings that present snapshots from the social life of these creatures are made. These misleading drawings are introduced in a particular sequence to engrave the scenario of the human evolution on the subconscious of society.
Activities like tool use and control of fire, such as depicted in those images, comes straight out of archaeological evidence.
Even in the most famous scientific publications, there frequently appear such window dressings called reconstructions and imaginary family tree drawings made by their inspiration. The imaginative power of evolutionists is not limited to fictional drawings and models. They go even further and shoot movies in which imaginary half-man, half-ape creatures act. However, all of these are pure deception. The only evidence at hand is generally nothing more than a few skull fragments or a tibia.
This is a process called forensic facial reconstruction, and yes, it is an approximation, and that is usually made clear. To the extent that you're just covering a skull with tissue, it's quite accurate as far as shape is concerned. There are details of soft tissues we can't deduce, but they don't impact the anatomical accuracy of the reconstruction so much as the superficial effect.
The hair, skin, nose, ears, lips, or other facial features of a living being cannot be determined from its bone remains.
Soft tissues are not fossilized, but they absolutely do leave traces. Facial muscles leave distinct traces on bones, and they're fossils that can be used to reconstruct the facial muscles and tell us a great deal about the face. I'm not sure what this is implying has been done to suit the theory. It is true that skin color and hair patterns cannot be determined, and artists do fill in those details using educated guesses. It is probably good to keep that in mind when looking at these illustrations, but that is not reason to dismiss the wealth of useful information that we do have. Is the claim here supposed to be that had these reconstructions been produced with different hair growth patterns or skin colors, they would have undermined our understanding of human evolution? I mean, forensic anthropologists have been using these techniques for decades and are continuing to refine their methods. The science behind it has been proven time and time again in reconstructing the faces of murder victims.
Evolutionists shape these soft tissues, which leave no trace in the fossil, to suit the purposes of their theory, and produce imaginary reconstructions in their workshops.
I'm skeptical of the value of what Ernest Houghton has to say about modern forensic sciences, seeing as he hasn't been alive for the last 60 years.
Ernest Houghton from Harvard University states that these drawings have no scientific value. You can, with equal facility, model on a Neanderthaloid skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. These alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value and are likely only to mislead the public.
So, that book is from 1931, remarking on quite a different era of forensics. Modern forensic techniques allow us to reconstruct faces with very useful accuracy. Perhaps some of these pictures from 76 years ago are inaccurate? I don't know. They're not provided or referenced. But perhaps it would be better to examine the work that has been done in the science of anthropology more recently. Unless your intent is to illuminate how well the science has progressed, in which case I'm all for it, do carry on.
Evolutionists go so far in this subject that they can even invent very different faces for the same skull. The three entirely different reconstructions made for the fossil called Zinjanthropus is a famous example showing how persistent evolutionists are in producing these false masks.
At this point, you might not be surprised to hear that those sketches are from the early 60s, when Zinjanthropus had just been discovered. Modern reconstructions are arrived at by considerably more precise methods and are remarkably consistent.
Evolutionists engage not only in drawing and modeling tricks, sometimes they commit deliberate forgeries. The most famous of these frauds is the Piltdown fossil, introduced in England in 1912 by an evolutionist named Charles Dawson. This fossil was presented as the most important transitional form between ape and man, and was displayed in museums for more than 30 years. Experts who re-examined the fossil in 1949 discovered that it was a forgery that had been produced by attaching an orangutan's jaw to a human skull.
Piltdown Man was a fraud, but why the hell are you framing it like a vast conspiracy? This is an example of the self-correcting nature of science. Mistakes are made, and there are outright frauds. These are discovered and corrected by scientists. Creationists did not discover this hoax. It was discovered by evolutionary scientists through legitimate scientific analysis.
Another intermediate transitional form fabricated by evolutionists was the Nebraska Man. This was cooked up in 1922 on the basis of a single fossil tooth. The evolutionists did not neglect to give it an ostentatious Latin name, Asparapithecus harold-cooki, or to make imaginary drawings related to it. It was soon revealed that the tooth that had been the source of inspiration for Nebraska Man, in fact, belonged to a wild pig.
The wild pig was an extinct species of peccary. Anyway, Nebraska Man was never considered to be a primate or human ancestor by the majority of scientists. The film says that Nebraska Man was fabricated and cooked up. Harold Cook, cooked up, fucking hell. But it was a mistake. It was considered inconclusive already, but continuing to dig at the site revealed more of the specimen and made the mistake clear. You really want to blame the media here for sensationalizing the find, don't you think? Rather than science for self-correcting as it should.
Many other fossil skulls have been presented as great evidence for evolution failed one by one. Neanderthal Man, was advanced as evidence in 1856, dismissed in 1960. Piltdown Man was advanced as evidence in 1912, dismissed in 1953. Zinzanthropus was advanced as evidence in 1959, dismissed in 1960. Ramapithecus was advanced as evidence in 1964, dismissed in 1979.
It'd be great if someone could help me out with how Neanderthals or Ramapithecus have been dismissed. Ramapithecus has been reclassified under Sivapithecus. Is that supposed to be the meaning of dismissed? And Neanderthals, are you kidding me? The species that we know the most about in our genus other than our own? The one we've been genetically analyzing? Seriously, what is this talking about? They seem like straight-up lies, but somebody please fill me in on the secrets. Speaking of lies, I'm going to get some cake.
Despite all these facts, these skulls are still presented to the public through the media and in some evolutionist textbooks as if they were scientific facts.
The video hasn't so much as made a passing reference to how they've been even suggested to not be facts, versus the overwhelming preponderance of evidence that they are. So, you'll have to forgive me if I don't know how the fuck to help you. This gets seriously insane, like frighteningly schizophrenic toward the end, doesn't it?
In many countries, an important part of the society supposes that evolution is a proven fact.
That evolution occurs is a fact. Links in the description. The theory of evolution by natural selection is an explanation of how it functions, an explanation of the facts. As an analogy, consider gravity. I know. That gravity is acting on you is a fact. The theory of gravitation was the best available explanation of how gravity functioned until the theory of relativity greatly improved our understanding of it.
A great deal of this so-called evidence of evolution, much of which has been dismissed by evolutionists themselves, is still presented to school children in their textbooks, where they are depicted as the ancestors of man. In fact, the truth that the evolutionists try so hard to deny and conceal is there for all to see. Species appeared all of a sudden and perfectly on the earth. That is, they were created. The divine creator, ruling over the whole of nature, created all kinds with their unique and perfect traits. That divine creator is Allah, the one and only God. He is the Lord of the heavens, the earth, and all that is between them.
Allahu Akbar!